James Monroe had always considered himself a thoughtful man. As the CEO of a mid-sized tech startup, he was known for his decisiveness, charm, and ability to rally his team. Yet, over the past year, something began to gnaw at him. Despite being surrounded by capable teammates and armed with reams of data, he'd made a series of poor decisions, investing in projects that fizzled, hiring people who didn't pan out, and letting perfectly good opportunities slip through his fingers. It wasn't ruining the company, not yet, but James could sense it. Something needed to change. One Friday, after a particularly frustrating board meeting, James found himself wandering into a small bookstore near his office. He had meant to drown his stress in a cup of coffee somewhere, but the warm, quiet ambiance of the shop invited him in. Row after row of books greeted him like old friends. His eyes swept idly across titles until one in particular stopped him, The Art of Clear Thinking by Rolf Dobelli. Intrigued, James flipped through the pages. The words seemed to reach out to him. Success doesn't come from avoiding missteps, but from identifying and counteracting your cognitive biases. Decisions aren't made in spreadsheets, they're made in minds full of errors. He didn't overthink it. He bought the book, walked out of the store, and began reading at a park across the street. From the very first page, Dobelli's lessons struck a chord. The book wasn't just about bad decisions, James realized. It was about why smart people, like himself, could make stunningly faulty choices, and how they could learn to think clearly in spite of it. That evening, after dinner and the humdrum of getting through emails subsided, James dived back into the book. Dobelli opened with something James immediately recognized as accurate: the problem of survivorship bias. The author explained how people tend to look only at successes while ignoring countless failures that didn't make it into the public eye. James thought back to his habit of imitating the practices of wildly successful startups. He always aimed to emulate companies like Apple or Amazon's early strategies, yet he rarely stopped to ask whether those strategies had failed for dozens of others that didn't make it. James stayed up late that night, devouring chapters one by one. Anchoring caught his attention next. The idea that the first number we hear, even an unrelated number, can irrationally shape our judgments. He remembered a negotiation with a potential investor last year. The investor had started with a lowball valuation for James's company. Though James had pushed back, the final negotiated figure ended up far lower than it should have been. Why? The initial anchor number had set the stage. Unbelievable, he muttered aloud as he read, shaking his head. By now, James felt like familiar cognitive traps were emerging from every corner of his experience. Social proof, availability bias, hindsight bias. Dobelli explained how human minds evolved to survive, not to make flawless judgments. In fact, the most obvious decisions, those that everyone seemed to agree on, were often shaped not by rational thinking, but by herd mentality. James jotted down examples from the many meetings and product launches he'd led where consensus was appealing, not because it was correct, but because dissent would have felt awkward. One case was glaring: his decision to develop a feature no one, deep down, truly believed in. Why? Everyone in the room nodded, simply because no one wanted to be the one to rock the boat. The following Monday, James decided it was time to act. It wasn't enough to marvel at Dobelli's insights. He needed to put them into practice. At the next team meeting, James began by describing something new he wanted to establish: buffers to counteract mental errors. He shared what he'd realized about survivorship bias and anchoring, using real-life examples. He even admitted to his team how biases like confirmation bias had led him to dismiss feedback he didn't want to hear in the past. To demonstrate how committed he was to change, James introduced a devil's advocate rule. From now on, in every major decision, one team member would be tasked with arguing against the consensus. The team seemed skeptical at first. This isn't about endless arguments or slowing things down, James clarified. It's about exposing blind spots before they hurt us. James couldn't blame them. The company culture had long prized efficiency and speed over reflection. But as the months passed, the changes began to pay off. In one instance, a developer tasked with being the devil's advocate spoke up during a product discussion. He pointed out that a minor feature being discussed was likely to fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy. Too many resources were being devoted to something simply because they had already invested time in it. Recognizing the truth in his words, the group shifted gears before wasting further effort. The lessons from Dobelli's book became an undercurrent in James's leadership. He began paying more attention to base rates, what typically happened in similar situations, instead of assuming his company was always the exception. There was a point where James nearly greenlit a costly new marketing campaign, betting on it out of optimism. But as one of his managers reminded him, using Dobelli's lessons, the base rate of success for similar campaigns had been incredibly low. Let's pump the brakes and reevaluate, James decided. It was the kind of humility he'd rarely shown before, but it saved them from what could have been a massive financial misstep. One morning, months after the bookstore discovery, James stood in front of his team and reflected. Change hadn't been easy. Addressing biases, not just in himself but in the company at large, had required effort, vulnerability, and hours of reflection. The results, though, were undeniable. The decisions being made now felt cleaner, sharper. The team trusted one another in ways they hadn't before, because questioning assumptions had become part of their culture. As James wrapped up the meeting, his eyes fell on his copy of The Art of Clear Thinking, now dog-eared and worn, sitting on his desk. He thought about how different things might have been if he'd never wandered into that bookstore. The mistakes he'd made in last year's board meetings weren't failures, he realized. They were just cognitive errors he hadn't yet learned to correct. James smiled to himself. He wasn't perfect, not even close. But with every clear decision, he moved a step closer to mastering the art of thinking and leading with clarity. James smiled to himself. He wasn't perfect, not even close. But with every clear decision, he moved a step closer to mastering the art of thinking and leading with clarity.